So could you tell me a bit more about how Helen Blackburn was campaigning against these issues and what techniques she was using?
Blackburn adopts a range of strategies, often quite familiar to those involved in the women's movement at this time. She's a noted author, and that for her, particularly given her role as an editor and her contributions in terms of pamphlets, it's not surprising that by the end of the 19th century, she's really recognised as a noted author in terms particularly of women's employment rights and paying conditions. She publishes a couple of really significant books, Working Women, Condition of Working Women and Women Under the Factory Acts. And at this point, around the turn of the 20th century, they're very much part of the debate about how women's work might be best recognised and how women might be, how their paying conditions could be best improved. That question of women shouldn't be left to work in hazardous, dangerous conditions, particularly, for instance, the sweated labour workshops that we see, for instance, in London and other cities in the late 19th century. She's absolutely adamant that these are not appropriate conditions in which women should be working. So she's very much part of that outpouring of pamphlets and leaflets and particularly books on these kind of subjects. She's also involved in the creation and development of a number of campaign organisations, the Freedom of Labour Defence Association, for instance, that she co-founds, very much agitating and discussing at length, lobbying the emerging labour movement at this time, thinking about how the labour movement should best respond to the question of women's labour, clearly relating to other questions about working class life and employment, but for Blackburn, women were very much part of the equation. They should be. She worked hard. She goes, for instance, she represents the suffrage question at the Trades Union Congress, for instance. So she's adamant that the debate around working class employment should absolutely feature questions of women's work as part and as central to all of that.
What was it about the working conditions for women that Blackburn particularly objected to?
Blackburn's really interesting, actually, in the links that she has with thinking about working class paying conditions. She's very much against the idea of protective legislation, that idea that certain types of particularly hazardous or dangerous work should be, that women shouldn't be allowed to pursue those types of employment. Other feminists were very much in favour of protective legislation, but for Blackburn, actually, this was a question of what we would now call equality, that idea that actually we shouldn't be depriving women of potential sources of employment, potential sources of wages. And this, for her, was particularly important for working class women who wouldn't necessarily have a great deal of choice in the kind of work that was available to them in their locality. So Blackburn does a great deal of work. She's interested in improving paying conditions, but she wants work to be available to women, open to women, on an equal basis, as it were, with men. She's not about restricting employment for women, but in fact opening it up.
And was she successful in changing women's working conditions? What would her legacy be?
I think Blackburn is very much part of what's happening in the latter part of the 19th century, that idea of the debate around women's work, better pay, better conditions. We can think, for instance, of the 1888 Match Girls strike that was all about paying conditions. And Blackburn is very much part of this debate about improving women's experiences and attitudes towards female employment. I think her legacy really links to that idea of the left, the idea of working class culture, and the idea that there should be legislative regulations put in place to improve pay, to improve conditions. So, for instance, she was very interested in factory work and the idea of regulating against harmful, negative, hazardous conditions. So she certainly plays a role in improving pay, improving conditions, and that really is part of the legacy that period of the women's movement leaves to us today.